To my first PowerPoint on whole text structure and terminology. I'm going to introduce you to whole text structure today and how you can wield this terminology that you're about to learn for your planning stage in your writing, and how you can then use and apply that in your written responses. So first of all, what do we mean by structure? Well, we are looking at language paper 1, question 3 here, and it asks you to look at the structure of how the writer has placed things, so character introductions, setting, and therefore the placement of these things and how that engages the reader to keep reading and feel certain ways or think about certain things. So the structure basically means the placement of items and shifts and movements through the piece. And to be able to understand structure as a whole, we need to understand structuring of texts in general as whole pieces before we then look at the question and therefore an extract from the whole. So let's have a look. You will need for this some form of paper to make notes on, and I will pause at various times. I'll ask you to pause this video to be able to make notes from the screen. So this is an example of a question 3 from language paper 1 from the fiction paper, and this is the structure question. So this is what it would look like. This is an example. It tells you initially that you need to think about the whole of the source. So it will be an extract from a novel or short story, and you need to use all of the source to be able to see the structure across the whole of the piece. The second line says, this text is from the beginning of a novel. And this is the line that we're going to focus on today. So we're not going to be focusing on the question in general. We're going to be thinking about this second line. Now, this line is the only line in question 3 that can change or adapt. And the word that can change or adapt is that beginning word. So it could say this text is from the beginning of a novel. It could say this text is from the middle of a novel or short story, or it could say it's from the end of a novel or short story. And so we need to wonder why this point is made and how this can help us. The actual question itself always remains the same. That's the third line. How has the writer structured this text to interest you as a reader? And it was always worth 8 marks. But like I said, today in this PowerPoint, we are only looking at this second line. So why is it important to know where the text has come from, where the source has come from within a novel? To understand that, we need to understand text structure as a whole of a novel or short story. So that means that we are going to look at what's called a basic plot structure, or sometimes referred to as a narrative arc. And you will see there are terminology on this slide. So all of the words in pink are the main terminology points for looking at a whole novel or short story. I'm going to walk you through some of these. There will be opportunity at the end of this discussion for you to draw your own version and potentially make notes. But we'll go through each of the terminology individually on the next slide anyway. So to start with, we have the exposition. So that's the first term. The exposition of the narrative arc is where the character is introduced. So your protagonist will be introduced in this opening stage of the novel. The setting will be established, any goals or motivations that your character might have, and perhaps and potentially any background information will be given. So you might have something like a flashback to give you any information you need to know in perhaps a prologue or something like that to start off and set up the novel to begin. Now, once that establishment phase, that exposition phase has begun, at the end of that, you will have what's called the inciting incident, the trigger or the kick-off point. This could be a good or a bad event that kind of incites, motivates the character to start their either literal or metaphorical journey through the plot. They could potentially meet the antagonist, the conflict character. Could potentially be something that kind of spurs them into action. Now, after the inciting accident, we have what's called the rising action. So that's a series or sequence of events, perhaps conflicts, struggles, blocks, questions that are posed that need to be resolved as we move through the plot. This builds tension. A sequence of series of events will build up that tension to the top, which is called the climax. Now, the climax is the pinnacle of tension, the point where everything comes to a head. It's full of action here, potentially lots of dialogue, quite frantic in pace, and it's the point where the reader should feel the most excited or sad or anxious, certainly tense for the protagonist, and the outcome of the climax is kind of the hinge point of the plot, the main event. Then after the climax, you have what's called the falling action. So that's that aftermath or the result of the climax. It may be that mysteries become resolved, questions become answered, any loose threads are tied up, and any other minor kind of character arcs are resolved. That takes us to the final plateau, which is the resolution stage. That's where the problem is resolved, hence resolution, and the enemy is usually vanquished, but certainly the mission is completed. You could also have a cliffhanger ending to keep your reader on edge, perhaps pose any big questions of morality at the end to get your reader thinking. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to pause here, please, and make some notes. You might like to draw a diagram of your own basic plot structure or narrative arc. If you can pause here, please. Okay, welcome back. On the next slide, we're going to go through, if you can make a note at the end when I ask you to pause again, of the terms and what to expect. The first term is exposition. This is the beginning of the story where background information is given, so your setting is introduced as well as character introductions, any other information that the reader needs to know before the storyline begins. Your second term is inciting incident. So that's the event that starts the storyline off, usually good or bad, but it makes the main character, that protagonist, begin their metaphorical or literal journey through the plot. Third term is rising action. It's the building up of tension through smaller events of suspense, leading up to that climactic point or main event in the plot. Number 4 is that climax, the climactic event. Peak of tension, point where the battle occurs, the major event of the story happens that makes the reader feel most excited, happy, sad, or scared. And finally, number 5, the falling action. It's the part of the story where the tension falls off, events lead to that final conclusion of the story, and all loose ends are tied up. And finally, and number 6 is the resolution. That's the end of the story where all plots are completed and finalised, or a cliffhanger. If you can pause there, please, to make notes on the terms and what they mean. Okay, Welcome back. So why are we introducing ourselves to these terms and what they mean? This is because, for a recap, remember that second line of the question is there to help you. It can present itself in one of three ways. So it could say the text is from the beginning of the novel or short story. It could say the text is from the middle of the novel or short story, or it could say the text is from the end of the novel or short story. So focusing on that line and what it says will help you to narrow down what you could potentially look for in your source before you start to worry about what you might find. For example, if the text is from the beginning of the novel, it is likely to include the exposition and possible inciting incident. Therefore, you can look for character and setting introductions, possibly flashbacks in time or flash forwards in time. You can also look for changes and shifts, so inside to outside, past to present, panoramic to detail. But we will go through some of these things more clearly in my second PowerPoint. You could say the text is from the middle of the novel, which means that we are likely to be looking at either rising action, climax, or falling action. Therefore, we can look out for lots of action, use of verbs, frantic tension, or foreshadowing, clues and hints about the future, potential red herrings. There could be lots of dialogue to show action between characters, perhaps potentially arguments. Certainly there will be a building up of that tension and an answering, if it is the falling action, of some questions for the reader. If the text is from the end of the novel, it is likely to be from the falling action and resolution stages. So therefore, in our source, we can look for flashbacks to remind us of what has happened before, flash forwards to hinting about the very end, answering of any questions, any big reveals, and potentially cliffhangers or shock or happy endings. So, by looking at that second line, we can narrow down what we are going to look for in the source, which will help us in our planning. We don't have to worry about the resolution if it's from the beginning of the novel. It helps and enables us to feel more confident in our use of terminology and wielding what we are going to be able to look for and spot. If you can now pause, please, to write down the events of this slide, and that will conclude this PowerPoint for you today. In our next PowerPoint, we will look directly at the question, and it will be a walkthrough of the Jamaica Inn question 3 question from language paper 1, and we will look at modelling some answers and how this all ties in with your planning. Thank you.